Well, the question you have to ask yourself is why did Putin start the war? And in my story, he started the war because he was profoundly committed to making sure that Ukraine did not become a Western bulwark on Russia's border. It's very important to understand that the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States at the time, was interested in making Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And the key element in the West strategy was NATO expansion into Ukraine. And from a Russian point of view, that was an existential threat. I understand that many people in the West refuse to believe that line of argument. They do not think that NATO expansion into Ukraine was an existential threat. But what they care, what they think doesn't matter. What matters is what Putin and his lieutenants thought. And they thought, and they continue to think, that Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat. And they started the war, the Russians started the war on February 24th, 2022, for the purpose of preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. They have been successful in that regard. And furthermore, they worried about Ukraine becoming a serious military threat to Russia. And what has happened is that Ukraine is being turned into a dysfunctional rump state. And Ukraine in no way will be a threat to Russia moving forward, nor, as I said, will it be in NATO. So in the end, Putin will have achieved his principal objectives. I think that it's quite clear from what was happening in the run-up to the war. This is in December of 2021, January of 2021, and the first half of February 2021, that Putin was doing everything he could to avoid a war. I know this is not a popular argument in the West, but if you go back and you look at what the Russians were doing, the Russians were trying to avoid a war. And it was the Americans, it's quite remarkable, it was the Americans who had no interest in negotiating with Putin and avoiding this war. The Russians were running around, the Americans were running around in December, January, February, right before the war started, saying that the Russians are likely to attack Ukraine. The Americans were making that argument. Why weren't the Americans trying to prevent a war? Why weren't they going to great lengths to negotiate with the Russians to avoid this war that they were predicting? I don't know, other than it seems like the Americans welcomed the war because the Americans thought that they could, with sanctions and with the Ukrainian army on the battlefield, bring the Russians to their knees. But the Americans and the West more generally made no effort to accommodate Russia in the run-up to the war when people in the West, especially the United States, thought a war was inevitable. Then the war breaks out. The Russians, very important to emphasize this, the Russians immediately reach out to the Ukrainians and say, let's start negotiating. Let's start negotiating an end to the war. This is right after it starts. And as you well know, those talks begin and end in Istanbul. These are the famous Istanbul negotiations in March 2022, early April 2022. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, why did those negotiations end? Especially since there was lots of evidence that the two sides, Ukraine and Russia, were moving toward a peace agreement. It's quite clear that those negotiations ended because the United States and the British, in the form of Boris Johnson, told the Ukrainians to walk away from the negotiations. And again, those negotiations looked like they were going to bear fruit. But we, mainly the United States, told them to walk away. We were not interested in a peace deal. We were interested in continuing the war. But what's happened over time is, of course, the balance of power in that war has shifted, and the Russians are now in the driver's seat.